A deathly silence falls over the ramshackle trading post as Elijah Morgan, the bookish shopkeeper with scarred hands and haunted eyes, reaches beneath the weathered counter. The Raven Gang, notorious for leaving no witnesses, has surrounded the last honest business in Copper Canyon. With his brother's broken pocket watch ticking softly in his vest and the fate of desperate homesteaders hanging in the balance, he faces the most feared outlaws in the territory. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Trust us, when Elijah finally makes his move, you'll understand why they still whisper his name in reverent tones throughout the territory. They still tell this tale in hushed tones across saloons and campfires throughout the New Mexico territory when the night grows deep and the whiskey runs low. In those quiet hours, folks recall the summer of 1882, when a solitary figure named Elijah Morgan arrived in Copper Canyon, a town so forsaken even the buzzards seemed to circle it with disappointment. Back then, Copper Canyon comprised a single, dusty street lined with dilapidated structures that leaned against one another like wounded soldiers. The once promising mining settlement had withered beneath a relentless sun and even more relentless predation. The buildings, constructed from local timber and sun-bleached adobe, cast long shadows across ground that hadn't felt the blessing of consistent rainfall in nearly 2 seasons. There stood a weather-beaten church whose bell had long ago been stolen for its metal, an abandoned sheriff's office, and the Copper Nugget Saloon, whose rough clientele seemed to change weekly as drifters and outlaws passed through like tumbleweeds. Unlike any settlement for 100 miles in any direction, Copper Canyon possessed something that sparked cruel ambition in hard men's hearts. A strategic location along the newly planned railroad route, promising wealth to whoever controlled the town. When the steel rails finally arrived, the land deeds and water rights carried enormous potential value, a fact not lost on those who accumulated power through violence. At first, there had been rumors, whispered with desperate optimism, that the railroad would transform their forgotten corner of the territory into a bustling hub of commerce. But those hopes had long soured when it became evident that darker forces had identified the same opportunity and were methodically eliminating anyone standing in their way. At the forefront of this cancer eating away at Copper Canyon's soul was Silas Blackwood, known throughout the territory as the Raven, for his distinctive black duster and the feathered hatband he wore as a mockery of civility. People called him Raven, not just for his appearance, but for his uncanny ability to sense weakness and opportunity, swooping down to claim whatever he desired with calculated precision. Blackwood arrived in Copper Canyon under the guise of a business opportunist, greasing the palms of the town's compromised mayor, Harold Finch, to secure strategic properties at deflated prices. Then, with methodical cruelty, these investments would mysteriously burn to the ground, be abandoned after owners disappeared, or simply claimed through forged documents that somehow withstood legal scrutiny. Nobody needed to guess too hard who orchestrated the string of violence and intimidation. They all knew, but knowing a predator stalks you and having the means to fight back are separate matters entirely. It didn't help that Sheriff Coleman, who wore his tarnished badge like a mark of shame rather than authority, conveniently found himself occupied whenever Blackwood's men rode through town. He insisted each murder, each burned homestead, each missing farmer was the tragic but inevitable consequence of frontier life, unfortunate accidents that simply happened with greater frequency in desperate times. The townsfolk recognized these accidents for what they were. They witnessed Mayor Finch's sudden prosperity reflected in his new suits and gold pocket watch. They observed how Sheriff Coleman managed to build a new stable behind his house while claiming the town lacked funds to hire additional deputies. They understood the corruption that allowed Blackwood's men, a collection of hardened killers known collectively as the Raven Gang, to terrorize with impunity. Yet they felt powerless beneath the crushing weight of organized tyranny. Into this cauldron of despair walked Elijah Morgan, leading a heavily laden mule and driving a modest wagon filled with crates and barrels. He claimed to be a merchant seeking to establish a trading post in an underserved community. No one thought twice about the slender, bespectacled man who spoke softly and seemed more comfortable among ledgers than colts. His unremarkable appearance, medium height, light brown hair graying prematurely at the temples, and wire-rimmed spectacles perched on a nose that had clearly been broken at least once, invited neither suspicion nor interest. To casual observers, Elijah seemed just another fool chasing opportunity in a dying town. But the people of Copper Canyon would soon discover that this unassuming shopkeeper carried secrets beneath his modest exterior, and his presence in their broken community was about to upset the careful balance of power Blackwood had established. Through years of calculated violence, in the days following his arrival, Elijah purchased the abandoned mercantile at the east end of town, paying cash to a surprised Mayor Finch, who hadn't expected anyone to want the property. The building had stood empty since its previous owner, Thomas Ward, disappeared while traveling to Santa Fe for supplies. Another unfortunate accident that coincided with his refusal to sell to Blackwood. Elijah spent the first week repairing the mercantile's leaking roof and broken windows, sweeping out years of dust and organizing his modest inventory of essential goods. He established fair prices for flour, coffee, ammunition and tools, often significantly lower than the inflated rates at which Blackwood's controlled businesses had been gouging the desperate townspeople. He purchased supplies from Martha Winters, the widow who operated a small farm outside town and had somehow managed to avoid Blackwood's attention, perhaps because her modest plot held little strategic value. Martha was among the few residents who had not succumbed to fear or corruption. She maintained her independence through sheer force of will and a shotgun she kept loaded at all times. "Your prices are fair," Martha commented as Elijah examined her vegetables. "But fairness isn't always rewarded in Copper Canyon. Blackwood doesn't appreciate competition." "I've heard about the town's difficulties," Elijah replied, adjusting his spectacles with hands that bore unusual calluses, not just the marks of honest labor, but something else that Martha couldn't quite identify. "I'll manage." Martha's eyes narrowed with concern. The last man who tried to run an honest business here vanished between here and Santa Fe, never even found his wagon. Elijah selected several potatoes and carrots, placing them carefully in a burlap sack. "Thank you for the warning," he said, his voice carrying an unexpected weight. "I take precautions when I travel." Despite his unremarkable demeanor, Elijah exhibited curious habits that didn't align with his bookish appearance. He rose before dawn, and those few early risers in town occasionally glimpsed him behind the mercantile, moving through what appeared to be carefully practiced routines. Not exercises for health, but something more purposeful, almost ritualistic. He arranged his store with methodical precision, always maintaining clear sightlines to the door and windows. The heavy oak counter he positioned to provide cover, not merely workspace. Most curiously, he maintained a small room at the back of the store where no one was permitted to enter. The few who glimpsed inside reported seeing nothing but a simple cot, a trunk, and a small table bearing a framed photograph whose image they couldn't discern. It didn't take long for Blackwood's men to take notice of the new enterprise. Just 2 weeks after the mercantile opened, Marcus Wade, Blackwood's right-hand man, visited the store accompanied by 2 enforcers whose hands never strayed far from their holsters. Wade, a tall man with cold eyes and a knife scar running from ear to jaw, swaggered between the shelves, occasionally picking up items and replacing them carelessly. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story. The other men positioned themselves strategically, one near the entrance, the other by the backroom door. Their message was clear, without words. We control the exits. Quite the operation you've started, Mr. Morgan, Wade remarked, running his finger along a shelf and inspecting it for dust. Finding none, his expression soured slightly. Surprising to see a new business open in such challenging times. Elijah continued arranging canned goods behind the counter, his movements unhurried. People need supplies wherever they live. Mr. Wade, even in challenging times. Wade's eyebrows lifted in mild surprise. You know who I am. I'm flattered. I make it my business to know my neighbors, Elijah replied, finally turning to face the man fully. Just as I imagine Mr. Blackwood makes it his business to know potential competitors. A tense silence followed as Wade studied the shopkeeper, perhaps searching for signs of fear or aggression. Finding neither, his confusion was evident. Most men either trembled or postured when confronted by the Raven gang. This shopkeeper did neither. Speaking of Mr. Blackwood, Wade continued, leaning against the counter, he's expressed interest in your property. Feels it would make an excellent headquarters for his expanding enterprises once the railroad arrives. He's prepared to offer you a fair price, twice what you paid Mayor Finch. Elijah removed his spectacles, cleaned them methodically with a cloth, and replaced them before responding. Please convey my appreciation to Mr. Blackwood, but I'm not interested in selling. I've only just established my business. Wade's cordial facade cracked slightly, revealing the menace beneath. Reconsider, Morgan. Copper Canyon has a way of becoming hazardous for those who don't recognize opportunity when offered. He flicked over a jar of molasses, which shattered on the floor, spreading thick, dark liquid across the freshly swept boards. Accidents happen. The enforcer near the door chuckled, his hand resting on his revolver's grip. Elijah glanced at the spreading molasses, his expression unreadable. Then with deliberate calm, he reached beneath the counter, every man in the room tensed, hands moving toward weapons. But Elijah produced only a rag, which he tossed onto the spill. I appreciate your concern for my welfare, Mr. Wade. However, I've faced hazards before. For a fleeting moment, something changed in Elijah's posture, a subtle shift that Wade couldn't quite identify, but which sent an unexpected chill down his spine. The sensation passed quickly, leaving Wade questioning what he'd sensed. With forced bravado, Wade kicked at the sticky mess on the floor. You've been warned, shopkeeper. Mr. Blackwood doesn't extend second offers. After the men departed, several minutes passed before Martha Winters emerged from behind a large barrel where she'd been selecting dry goods during the confrontation. You're either the bravest or the most foolish man I've ever met, she said quietly. Elijah knelt to clean the molasses, his movements precise and economical. Sometimes there's little difference between the two, Mrs. Winters. Martha studied him with newfound curiosity. How did you know they wouldn't draw on you when you reached under the counter? A faint smile crossed Elijah's face as he continued scrubbing. I didn't. Word of the confrontation spread through Copper Canyon by nightfall, carried by Martha to neighboring farms and through the barkeep at the Copper Nugget to the town's remaining residents. Reactions were mixed. Some admired the newcomer's courage, others lamented what they saw as his inevitable fate. A few began quietly shifting their business to the mercantile, despite the risk of being seen defying Blackwood's unofficial monopoly. The days that followed brought a fragile peace. Wade did not return, though occasionally one of Blackwood's men would stand across the street, watching the mercantile for hours before departing. Elijah continued his dawn rituals behind the store, maintained his methodical organization of goods, and began extending credit to families who couldn't afford basics like flour and medicine. Each evening he would lock the front door precisely. At sunset, light a single lamp in the back room and remain there until dawn. Some claimed they could see his shadow moving across the window shade for hours, pacing or sitting at the small table, perhaps writing in the leather-bound journal a few customers had glimpsed him keeping. Daniel Cooper, a 12-year-old boy, whose father had vanished after refusing to sell their small ranch to Blackwood, began helping at the store after school. He swept floors, organized shelves, and delivered goods to elderly residents who couldn't make the trip themselves. Elijah paid him fairly and never questioned why the boy sometimes lingered until closing, reluctant to return to a home that felt emptier with each passing month. One evening, as Daniel helped close the store, he gathered the courage to ask the question that had been gnawing at him since the confrontation with Wade. "Mr. Morgan, aren't you scared of the Raven gang?" Elijah paused in his counting of the day's meager earnings. For a moment, a distant look crossed his face, as though he were seeing something far beyond the walls of the mercantile. "I've learned something important about fear, Daniel," he said finally. "It's not the absence of fear that makes a person brave. It's what they choose to do, despite being afraid." Daniel considered this, then ventured another question. "Is that why you came here, to be brave?" Elijah carefully closed the cash box before answering. "I came because sometimes standing aside is more frightening than standing up." He glanced at the back room where the mysterious photograph sat. "Go on home now. Your mother will be worried." As Daniel left, neither he nor Elijah noticed the figure watching from the shadows across the street. Jeremiah Black, Blackwood's most skilled scout and tracker, the man observed the interaction with cold calculation before slipping away to report to his employer. That night, as lamps were extinguished across the struggling town, a meeting took place in Blackwood's private room above the Copper Nugget Saloon. The Raven himself, immaculately dressed in his signature black attire, listened to reports from his lieutenants with growing irritation. "The shopkeeper's building influence," Wade reported, nursing a glass of expensive whiskey imported from Kentucky. "People are starting to visit his store openly, not just sneaking in after dark." Jeremiah Black, leaner and more weathered than the other men, spoke with quiet precision. "He's different, watches everything, sees patterns. The way he moves reminds me of soldiers I tracked during the war, men who'd seen too much fighting." Blackwood swirled amber liquid in his crystal glass, his expression thoughtful. His features were sharp and aristocratic, belying the brutal methods he employed. A shopkeeper with a military background isn't unusual. Half the men who survived the war had to find new occupations. "It's more than that," Black insisted, a rare note of uncertainty in his voice. "He keeps that store arranged for defense, always knows where everyone is in the room, and there's something about his hands." "His hands," Blackwood raised an eyebrow. "They don't match the rest of him. Those aren't just a shopkeeper's hands." Blackwood considered this information, then turned to a man sitting silently in the corner, Luther Cole, whose skill with a revolver had ended more lives than anyone else in the gang. "What do you think, Luther?" Cole looked up slowly, his weathered face impassive. "If he concerns you, I can visit his store tomorrow. End the problem." A cold smile spread across Blackwood's face. "Not yet. First, let's apply some pressure. See what our mysterious shopkeeper does when truly provoked." He turned to Wade. "That boy who works for him, Cooper. His father disappeared owing me money. Perhaps it's time to collect from the family. Burn their ranch tonight. Make it clear who's responsible." Wade's lips curled into a cruel smile. "With pleasure, Mr. Blackwood." Later that night, as Elijah sat in his back room cleaning the photograph frame with meticulous care, a distant glow illuminated the sky at the edge of town. Flames reached toward the stars as the Cooper ranch burned, the light reflecting in the shopkeeper's spectacles as he stood at his window, watching. His hand moved to the trunk beside his cot, resting on its weathered surface for a long moment before slowly withdrawing. The time wasn't right. Not yet, but as the smoke rose over Copper Canyon, something hardened in Elijah Morgan's expression, a silent promise that the calculation was changing. The mild-mannered shopkeeper carefully returned the photograph to the table, and in the flickering lamplight, the image became briefly visible. A younger Elijah in a Union Army uniform, standing beside another man who bore a striking resemblance, both smiling with the innocence of those who had not yet witnessed the horrors that awaited them. Dawn broke over the Cooper ranch with cruel indifference, illuminating the smoldering ruins where a family home had stood just hours before. Daniel Cooper stood beside his weeping mother, their faces blackened with ash and etched with the hollow shock that follows sudden catastrophe. The barn and house were nothing but charred timbers and smoking debris. Only the windmill remained intact, its metal frame twisted slightly from the heat, but still turning lazily in the morning breeze. Word of the fire spread through Copper Canyon faster than the flames themselves had consumed the Cooper homestead. By mid-morning, a small gathering of neighbors had arrived with whatever they could spare: blankets, food, offers of shelter. These acts of kindness, though genuine, carried an undercurrent of fear. Each person who helped the Coopers cast nervous glances toward town, aware they might be marked for similar retribution. Elijah Morgan arrived last, his wagon loaded with essentials: canvas for a temporary shelter, cooking supplies, preserved food. He worked methodically alongside the others, saying little but accomplishing much. When he finally approached Sarah Cooper, Daniel's mother, his expression revealed nothing of the cold determination that had settled in his chest during the night. "Mrs. Cooper, I've prepared the storeroom behind my shop. It's small but secure. You and Daniel are welcome to stay there until you decide your next steps." Sarah Cooper, her eyes red-rimmed and vacant, nodded numbly. "They left this," she said, extending a crumpled piece of paper. On it was drawn a crude raven, identical to the symbol backwoodsmen sometimes carved into the doors of those who defied them. Elijah studied the paper, his fingers tracing the menacing bird with unusual intensity. "I understand," he said softly, though what exactly he understood remained unclear to those watching. "Daniel can continue working at the store, double wages." Something in Elijah's tone made Sarah look up sharply. "Mr. Morgan, I appreciate your help, but we don't need charity." "It's not charity," Elijah replied, adjusting his spectacles. "Daniel has proven himself valuable. I've been meaning to increase his wages regardless." Though his voice remained gentle, there was a firmness that discouraged further argument. Later that day, as Daniel helped arrange the storeroom for his mother, the boy's shock gave way to simmering anger. "Mr. Morgan," he said suddenly, setting down a crate with unnecessary force, "why does Blackwood hate us so much? What did we ever do to him?" Elijah paused in his inventory of supplies. "Blackwood doesn't hate you, Daniel. That would require him to see you as people. To men like him, others are merely obstacles or tools." "My pa wasn't an obstacle," Daniel insisted, his voice cracking. "He just wanted to keep our land." Elijah studied the boy carefully, weighing his words. "Your father stood for something. Sometimes that's enough to make a man dangerous in the eyes of those who recognize no boundaries." "Standing for something didn't save him," Daniel muttered bitterly. "No," Elijah agreed, his eyes distant, "but it might have saved something in him." He reached into his vest and withdrew a small pocket watch with a cracked face. For a moment, he seemed lost in contemplation of the timepiece before returning it to his pocket. Sometimes survival isn't the measure of victory, Daniel. Sometimes just refusing to bend is triumph enough. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Sheriff Coleman, who entered the store with the reluctant air of a man performing an unwelcome duty. The sheriff's uniform was immaculate, in sharp contrast to his neglected responsibilities. He removed his hat, revealing thinning hair and a deeply lined forehead. "Mr. Morgan," he began, avoiding eye contact with Daniel. "I've come about the unfortunate fire at the Cooper place." "Unfortunate," Elijah repeated, the word hanging in the air like an accusation. Coleman shifted uncomfortably. "These things happen out here. Probably a lantern knocked over, or maybe a cooking fire got out of control. Is that your official determination, Sheriff?" Elijah's tone remained neutral, but something in his posture made Coleman take an involuntary step back. "Well, there's not much evidence to suggest otherwise." "Perhaps you overlooked this," Elijah said, producing the paper with the raven symbol. "It was left at the scene." Coleman barely glanced at it. "Likely just some prank. Local boys leaving their mark." Daniel's face flushed with anger. "It was Blackwood's men. Everyone knows it." "That's quite an accusation, son," Coleman replied, with forced authority. "Mr. Blackwood is a respected businessman in these parts." Elijah placed a restraining hand on Daniel's shoulder. "Thank you for your diligence, Sheriff. I'm sure you'll continue your investigation with the same thoroughness you've shown in previous incidents." Coleman's eyes narrowed at the thinly veiled rebuke. "You do well to remember you're new here, Morgan. Copper Canyon has its own way of doing things." "So I've noticed," Elijah replied, turning back to his inventory. The dismissal was unmistakable. After the sheriff departed, Martha Winters arrived. With fresh bread and information, the two commodities she distributed with equal generosity throughout Copper Canyon. "Coleman went straight to the copper nugget after leaving here," she reported, arranging her offerings on the counter. "Blackwood's men are celebrating openly. They're not even pretending anymore." Elijah nodded, unsurprised. "And the townspeople?" Martha's weathered face tightened. "Scared, but something's changing. This fire, burning out a widow and her boy, it's crossed a line for some folks. Santiago Rivera says he'll bring his business here exclusively now. The Wilkinsons, too." "Courage can be contagious," Elijah observed. "So can retribution," Martha countered. "Blackwood won't tolerate growing defiance. He'll make another example, and soon." For several days, an uneasy tension hovered over Copper Canyon. The mercantile saw a cautious increase in customers, though many still approached via back alleys or waited until dusk. Elijah extended credit to those who needed it, kept his prices fair, and maintained his curious dawn rituals behind the store, exercises that now occasionally drew the attention of Daniel Cooper, who would watch surreptitiously from the storeroom window. What the boy observed puzzled him deeply. The mild-mannered shopkeeper moved with a fluid precision unlike anything Daniel had seen before. Elijah would draw and holster an empty gun with uncanny speed, repeating the motion dozens of times. He would practice what appeared to be hand-to-hand combat techniques against an imaginary opponent, his movements economical and lethal. Most strangely, he would occasionally stand perfectly still for extended periods, eyes closed, before executing a blindingly fast sequence of movements that ended with his hand hovering exactly where an opponent's vital areas would be. One morning, after witnessing a particularly impressive display, Daniel couldn't contain his curiosity. "Were you a soldier, Mr. Morgan?" he asked as they opened the store together. Elijah paused in arranging a display of canned peaches. "Why do you ask?" "I saw you practicing," Daniel admitted. "Those movements, they aren't what shopkeepers usually know." A flicker of something, perhaps amusement, perhaps wariness, crossed Elijah's face. "I've had various occupations, Daniel. Some required specialized skills. Could you teach me?" The question burst forth impulsively. Elijah studied the boy for a long moment. "Some knowledge comes with a heavy price, Daniel. I'm not certain you'd want to pay it." "I want to stand up to them," Daniel insisted, "like my pa did." Elijah's expression softened. "Your father stood up to them with words and principles. That requires its own kind of courage." "A lot of good it did him," Daniel muttered. Elijah considered his response carefully. "Very well, I'll teach you some basics. Self-defense only. But your mother must agree first." Sarah Cooper proved surprisingly receptive to the idea, though her reasons differed from her son's. "The world's taken enough from us," she told Elijah privately. "If Daniel can learn to protect himself, at least I'll worry less." And so, in the early morning hours before the store opened, Daniel joined Elijah in the small yard behind the mercantile. The lessons began simply: proper stance, balance, awareness of surroundings. Elijah emphasized discipline and restraint over aggression, much to Daniel's initial disappointment. "I want to learn to fight," the boy complained after a particularly frustrating session focused entirely on footwork. "You're learning something more important," Elijah corrected. "You're learning when not to fight. The most dangerous men I've known weren't the strongest or fastest. They were the ones who understood the moment when violence became necessary, not merely satisfying." As these quiet lessons continued, Blackwood's grip on Copper Canyon tightened in response to the subtle shift in allegiance. The Raven Gang increased their visible presence, riding through town at all hours, disrupting what little legitimate commerce remained. They implemented a protection fee on businesses and farms, collected weekly with thinly veiled threats. Those who refused faced immediate consequences: broken windows, missing livestock, or worse. Jeremiah Black, Blackwood's scout, took to watching the mercantile for hours at a stretch, positioned in the abandoned milliner's shop across the street. His presence was neither hidden nor explained, creating an atmosphere of constant surveillance designed to intimidate customers and wear down Elijah's resolve. Yet the shopkeeper's routine remained unchanged. He opened precisely at sunrise, closed at sunset, maintained fair prices and extended credit to those in need. His expression betrayed nothing, neither fear nor defiance, when confronted with Blackwood's intimidation tactics. This unnatural calm puzzled Jeremiah Black, who reported his observations during nightly meetings at the Copper Nugget. "He doesn't react," Black explained to Blackwood and the assembled lieutenants. "Most men show something: anger, fear, even just irritation. Morgan's face might as well be carved from stone." Blackwood, elegantly attired as always despite the rough surroundings, stroked the feather in his hat band thoughtfully. "Perhaps our approach has been too subtle. Morgan clearly needs a more personal demonstration of my authority." "Marcus." Wade grinned, revealing a gold tooth that glinted in the lamplight. "Let me pay him another visit. I'll bring Luther this time." "Not yet," Blackwood decided, raising a hand. "First, let's isolate him. Close the noose slowly." He turned to Wade. "Spread the word. Anyone trading with Morgan will find their own properties suffering unfortunate accidents. Make an example of someone, preferably one of his newer customers." Wade nodded, already considering targets. "The Santiago family has been spending freely at the mercantile." "Perfect," Blackwood agreed. "Their farm is remote enough that intervention would be impossible. Do it tonight." Later that evening, as Elijah closed the store, Martha Winters arrived, breathless with warning. "They're going after the Santiagos," she gasped, leaning against the doorframe. "Wade and 4 others rode out 20 minutes ago." Elijah's expression didn't change, but his body tensed almost imperceptibly. "How do you know?" "Robbie Tucker heard them planning at the saloon. The boy works as a stable hand there, but doesn't share Blackwood's views. He ran to tell me as soon as he could slip away." Elijah locked the door with deliberate calm. "Thank you, Martha. Please check on Mrs. Cooper and Daniel. Keep them inside tonight." "What are you going to do?" Martha demanded, anxiety evident in her voice. "Whatever becomes necessary," Elijah replied, and something in his tone made Martha step back instinctively. "You can't face them alone," she protested. "That's suicide." A strange, distant smile played across Elijah's face. "I won't be facing anyone. I'm simply going to check my supply line. The Santiago farm provides some of my best produce." Martha wasn't fooled by the casual response. "Elijah, please, this isn't your fight." "It became my fight when I decided to open a store in Copper Canyon," he said simply. "Now please look after the Coopers." After Martha departed, reluctantly agreeing to his request, Elijah entered his private room at the back of the store. He pulled the trunk from beneath his cot and opened it for the first time since arriving in Copper Canyon. Inside lay his past, carefully packed away but never truly abandoned. From the trunk, he withdrew a gun belt of well-oiled leather, supple despite its age. The holsters, positioned for cross-draw, contained twin Remington 1875 revolvers with customized grips and triggers. These were not the flashy weapons of a showman, but the practical tools of someone who used firearms for their intended purpose with deadly efficiency. Beneath the gun belt lay a dark blue coat, faded from years of sun and weather but still serviceable. As Elijah lifted it, something metallic caught the lamplight, a tarnished badge pinned to the inside lapel, hidden from casual view but positioned where the wearer would know it remained. For a long moment, Elijah stared at the badge, his expression unreadable. Then, with practiced movements, he strapped on the gun belt, adjusted it to sit comfortably, and slipped the coat over his shoulders. The transformation was subtle but profound. His posture shifted, his movements became more fluid, and his eyes took on a focused intensity that had previously been carefully concealed. From a hidden compartment in the trunk, he extracted a small wooden box. Opening it revealed a collection of cartridges nestled in velvet, each round hand-loaded with meticulous care. He filled both revolvers and spare ammunition loops, then checked each weapon with the automatic precision of someone who had performed these actions thousands of times. Finally, he removed a folded piece of paper from the photograph frame on his small table. He stared at it briefly before tucking it into his breast pocket, patting it once as if for reassurance. The Santiago farm lay 3 miles outside town, close enough to serve the small community, but far enough to remain somewhat isolated from Copper Canyon's troubles. It was a modest operation run by Miguel Santiago, his wife Elena, and their 3 children. They grew vegetables, raised a few goats, and produced cheese that was sought after throughout the territory. The farm comprised a small adobe house, a barn, cheese-making shed, and several fenced pastures. Lamplight glowed from the house windows as the family finished their evening meal, unaware of the danger approaching. Wade and his men came from the north, keeping to the shallow arroyos that crisscrossed the landscape. They carried torches and coal oil, tools of their particular trade. Their plan was simple and practiced: surround the house, drive the family out, burn the buildings, and leave another raven symbol as warning. What they didn't expect was the solitary figure who had reached the farm before them, moving across the landscape like a shadow, familiar with every dip and rise in the terrain from weeks of careful observation. Wade stationed his men around the property, whispering final instructions. "Remember, we want them alive to spread the message. Scare them, rough them up if needed, but no killing unless they resist." As Wade finished speaking, he noticed something odd, a flicker of movement where none should be. He squinted into the darkness, trying to make sense of the shape that seemed to materialize from the shadows near the barn. "Someone's here," he hissed to the nearest gang member, reaching for his revolver. Before his hand touched the weapon, the figure spoke, voice carrying clearly across the yard. "Good evening, Mr. Wade. I believe we've met before." Wade froze, recognition dawning. "Morgan, what the hell are you doing here?" Elijah stepped forward, the moonlight revealing his transformed appearance. The unassuming shopkeeper was gone, replaced by a man whose every movement telegraphed lethal capability. "I've come to discuss your business practices." Elijah replied, his voice eerily calm. "Specifically your approach to competition." Wade recovered from his surprise, a sneer spreading across his face. "5 guns against 1, shopkeeper. Poor odds, even if you were handy with that piece." "Interesting. On calculation," Elijah responded, seeming almost contemplative. "But I believe your count is off." Wade's confusion lasted only a second before he heard a thud behind him. Turning, he saw one of his men slump to the ground unconscious. Another figure emerged from the darkness, Daniel Cooper, holding a shovel with a determined grip. "What the—" Wade began, but was interrupted by the unmistakable sound of a shotgun being cocked. Miguel Santiago stood in his doorway, weapon raised. "My family is not alone, senor," he called, his accent thickening with anger. From various positions around the farm, lanterns suddenly illuminated. Martha Winters by the garden wall, old Jenkins from the neighboring homestead near the well, and 3 more local farmers positioned strategically around the property. Wade's remaining men looked to him with growing uncertainty. Their advantage had evaporated in seconds. "This is a private matter, Morgan," Wade growled, trying to maintain control of the situation. "Blackwood won't tolerate interference." "That's exactly what we're counting on," Elijah replied, his hand resting casually near his holster. "It's time Mr. Blackwood understood that Copper Canyon is no longer his exclusive territory." For the first time, Wade felt a chill that had nothing to do with the desert night. The shopkeeper who stood before him now moved and spoke like a different person entirely, someone accustomed to confronting violence rather than avoiding it. "What's your play here, Morgan?" Wade demanded. "You think a few farmers with pitchforks can stand against the Raven gang?" "I think people defending their homes are more formidable than men burning them," Elijah answered. "But tonight isn't about winning a war. It's about establishing boundaries." As he spoke, Elijah's hand moved with blinding speed. Before Wade could react, the revolver at his hip was smoothly drawn and fired into the ground between Wade's feet. The shot echoed across the landscape, causing Wade to stagger backward in shock. "That was a warning," Elijah stated flatly. "The next one won't be." The remaining gang members exchanged nervous glances, their confidence crumbling. None of them had even seen Morgan draw, let alone aim. "You've made a grave mistake," Wade threatened, though his voice lacked conviction. Blackwood will adapt or fall," Elijah interrupted. "That's the nature of men like him. Now take your wounded and leave. Consider this farm, and every farm whose owner chooses to stand with us, protected territory." Wade hesitated, calculating his options. The odds had shifted dramatically, and Morgan had demonstrated surprising skill. Finally, practicality overcame pride. "This isn't over," he spat, signaling his men to retrieve their unconscious comrade. "No," Elijah agreed, holstering his weapon with the same uncanny speed with which he'd drawn it. "I expect it's just beginning." As Wade and his men retreated into the darkness, the gathered farmers approached Elijah with a mixture of awe and uncertainty. They had witnessed something none had expected. Not just a defense of the Santiago farm, but the first successful resistance against Blackwood's reign of terror. "How did you know they were coming?" Miguel Santiago asked, lowering his shotgun. "Martha brought word," Elijah explained, "but we've been preparing for something like this. Each of you has suffered under Blackwood's control. Tonight, we proved that together we can change that equation." Daniel Cooper approached, still clutching his shovel. "Did you see his face when you drew? He didn't even have time to blink." Elijah placed a restraining hand on the boy's shoulder. "This isn't a game, Daniel. Men like Wade don't forget humiliation. We've won tonight, but we've also escalated matters considerably. Martha Winters nodded grimly. Blackwood will come himself, next time, with Luther Cole and everyone else he can muster. Good, Elijah said, and something in his voice made the others look at him with renewed curiosity. It's time I met Mr. Blackwood face to face. As the group dispersed with plans to meet the following day at the Mercantile, Martha lingered behind. Those guns, she said quietly, nodding toward Elijah's revolvers. Those aren't store-bought for self-defense. And your draw, I've never seen anything like it. Elijah's expression remained neutral. We all have pasts, Mrs. Winters. Yours seems particularly relevant to our current situation, she pressed. Who are you really, Elijah Morgan? Elijah looked toward the horizon, where the first hint of dawn had begun to lighten the eastern sky. Someone who understands what happens when good people do nothing, he replied. Then more softly, and someone who's made that mistake before. Before Martha could question him further, Elijah turned toward town. We should return before sunrise. There's much to prepare. As they walked back toward Copper Canyon, Martha couldn't shake the impression that the quiet shopkeeper who had arrived weeks ago was merely a facade, the shell of a man concealing something far more dangerous beneath. Whether that danger represented salvation or destruction for their struggling town remained to be seen, but one thing was certain. The balance of power in Copper Canyon had shifted, and Silas Blackwood would not take the challenge lightly. News of the confrontation at the Santiago farm spread through Copper Canyon like wildfire. By midday, half the town had heard some version of how Elijah Morgan and a group of local farmers had driven off Blackwood's men. Each retelling added embellishments. Some claimed Elijah had disarmed 3 men simultaneously. Others insisted he'd shot a weapon right out of Marcus Wade's hand. The truth, though less spectacular, was remarkable enough. The bookish shopkeeper had revealed himself to be something else entirely. At the Copper Nugget Saloon, Silas Blackwood received Marcus Wade's report with deadly calm. Unlike his subordinate, who fumed and paced, raging about humiliation, Blackwood remained seated, methodically cleaning his fingernails with a small silver knife. "Let me understand this clearly," Blackwood said, his cultured voice at odds with the menace beneath it. "You were outmaneuvered by a shopkeeper and a collection of farmers with pitchforks." Wade adjusted his collar nervously. "He wasn't alone, and it wasn't what we expected. He had them organized, positioned, and he can draw faster than anyone I've ever seen," interrupted one of the other men who'd been at the Santiago farm. "Didn't even see his hand move, just heard the shot." Blackwood's eyes narrowed at this detail. He set down his knife and steepled his fingers. "Describe this draw to me." "Precisely." The man shifted uncomfortably under Blackwood's intense gaze. It was fluid, no wasted movement, like he wasn't even thinking about it, and his stance changed, squared up, balanced, like a gunfighter's. "Cross draw?" Blackwood asked sharply. The man blinked in surprise. "Yes, sir. 2 Remingtons. Worn high for cross draw." A strange expression crossed Blackwood's face, something between recognition and disbelief. He rose abruptly, poured himself a measure of brandy from a crystal decanter, and moved to the window overlooking the dusty main street. "Luther," he called to the silent figure in the corner, "fetch my old journal, the leather one." Luther Cole nodded once and left the room. During his absence, no one spoke. Blackwood stared out the window, occasionally sipping his brandy with a distracted air. When Luther returned with a worn leather journal, Blackwood took it without a word and thumbed through the pages until he found what he sought. The others watched as his expression darkened further. "Interesting," he murmured, more to himself than the room. "Very interesting indeed." "What is it, boss?" Wade ventured. Blackwood closed the journal with a decisive snap. "It seems our Mr. Morgan may not be who he claims to be." He turned to Luther Cole. "What's your assessment of him?" The laconic gunman considered before answering. Never seen him draw, but he watches everyone, keeps his back to walls, knows. Sightlines, military maybe, or law. Blackwood nodded as if confirming his own suspicions. Morgan isn't his real name. I'd stake my fortune on it. He gestured to Jeremiah Black. I want everything about his past, where he came from, who he associated with, every detail, no matter how small. Black frowned. Already tried tracking his history. Trail goes cold in Santa Fe. Before that, nothing. Try harder, Blackwood snapped. And Luther, I want you to test him. Not a killing. I need information first. Just provoke a reaction. See what he does. Under pressure, Luther Cole nodded, his weathered face betraying nothing of his thoughts. Meanwhile, at the Mercantile, an impromptu meeting had gathered in the back storeroom. The participants represented a cross-section of Copper Canyon's remaining decent citizens. Martha Winters, Miguel Santiago, and his eldest son, the Cooper family, Old Jenkins, and a half-dozen others who had begun to rally against Blackwood's tyranny. What happened last night changes everything, Martha was saying, her usually calm voice edged with excitement. We've shown that together we can stand against them. Miguel Santiago nodded vigorously. For the first time, they retreated. They are not invincible. Elijah, standing near the door where he could monitor the street, raised a cautioning hand. What happened last night was a temporary victory, not a war won. Blackwood will respond with greater force next time. Then we'll be ready, Daniel Cooper declared, his young face alight with the intoxication of their small triumph. No, Elijah said firmly. We caught them by surprise once. That advantage is gone. Blackwood is many things, but he isn't stupid. He'll adapt. Sarah Cooper, who had remained silent until now, spoke up. What do you suggest, Mr. Morgan? We can't go back to cowering. Elijah adjusted his spectacles in a gesture that had become familiar to them all. We organize, establish communications, create mutual defense arrangements. Farmers within shouting distance coordinate watches. No one travels alone. Everyone carries protection. And the law? Old Jenkins asked bitterly. Sheriff Coleman's as useful as a screen door on a submarine. A flicker of something, perhaps amusement, perhaps agreement, crossed Elijah's face. The sheriff has made his choices. We'll work around him, not through him. For the next hour, they hammered out practical arrangements. Miguel Santiago would coordinate the outlying farms. Martha would serve as information hub within town. Jenkins, a former blacksmith, would repair and maintain whatever weapons they could muster. Training schedules were established for those willing to learn self-defense. Through it all, Elijah guided rather than commanded, offering suggestions instead of orders, yet somehow shaping the outcome nevertheless. By the time the meeting concluded, the ragtag group had become something more cohesive, the beginnings of organized resistance. As the others filed out through the back entrance to avoid being seen together, Martha lingered behind. You still haven't answered my question from last night, she said quietly. Who are you, Elijah Morgan? Elijah was silent for a long moment, weighing his response. Does it matter? It might, Martha replied. These people are risking everything based on your guidance. They deserve to know who they're following. They're not following me, Elijah countered. They're following their own desire for justice. Martha held his gaze steadily. You know what I mean. Those guns, that draw. You're no ordinary shopkeeper. Elijah sighed, removing his spectacles and cleaning them methodically. My past is complicated, Martha, some of it dangerous. The less you know, the safer you remain. Safety is a luxury none of us has anymore, she replied dryly. Before Elijah could respond, Daniel burst through the door, breathless and wide-eyed. Mr. Morgan, they're coming. Blackwood's men. Luther Cole is with them. Elijah's demeanor shifted. Instantly, the contemplative shopkeeper replaced by the alert strategist. How many? What direction? Just two, Luther and another man I don't recognize, coming straight up the street, heading here. Elijah replaced his spectacles and nodded calmly. "Martha, take Daniel and Sarah through the back. Wait at your place. Until I come for you. You can't face Luther Cole alone," Martha protested. "He's killed more men than smallpox." "I'm not facing anyone," Elijah replied, moving toward the front of the store. "I'm receiving customers. Now go, please." After they had departed, reluctantly obeying his instructions, Elijah straightened his modest shop, positioning himself behind the counter with an unobstructed view of the entrance. His manner was relaxed, but his eyes focused with laser intensity on the approaching figures visible through the window. Luther Cole entered first, ducking slightly under the doorframe. He was tall and rangy, with the leathery skin of someone who'd spent decades in harsh sun. His eyes, pale blue and unsettlingly empty, surveyed the interior with professional thoroughness. The second man, younger and sporting an elaborate mustache, waxed to sharp points, lingered near the door, hand resting casually near his holster. "Afternoon, gentlemen," Elijah greeted them as if they were any other customers. "Something I can help you with today?" Luther Cole approached the counter with unhurried steps. He wore his gun low on his hip, positioned for a quick draw. The handle was worn smooth from years of use, lacking the ornate engraving favored by showmen. "Heard you had some trouble with Mr. Blackwood's associates last night," Luther said, his voice a dry rasp from years of dust and tobacco. "No trouble," Elijah replied evenly. "Just a misunderstanding about property rights." Luther studied Elijah with the detached curiosity of a scientist examining an unusual specimen. "You don't look like much," he observed. "Yet Wade says you draw like lightning." Elijah's expression remained neutral. "Mr. Wade exaggerates. I'm just a shopkeeper trying to make a living." A ghost of a smile touched Luther's weathered face. No, you're not." He picked up a tin of coffee, examining it with feigned interest. "That's good quality work, keeping your hands where I can see them. Most men would have them below the counter by now, reaching for something." "As I said, I'm just a shopkeeper." Luther set down the coffee tin with deliberate care. "I knew a man once who could draw like Wade described. During the war, federal marshal named Everett. If the name meant anything to Elijah, his face didn't show it." "Interesting coincidence." "Very," Luther agreed. "Especially since this Marshal Everett disappeared about 7 years ago, after his brother was killed by a gang he was hunting." He leaned forward slightly. "A gang that left raven symbols at their crime scenes." The air in the small shop seemed to crystallize with tension. The younger man by the door shifted his weight nervously, sensing the dangerous undercurrents. "History is full of coincidences," Elijah remarked, his voice unchanged. Luther's eyes narrowed fractionally. Marshal Everett had a distinctive style. Cross-draw, 2 Remingtons custom-made, shot a man I rode with once, caught him square between the eyes at 30 paces. "Impressive marksmanship," Elijah commented. "It was," Luther agreed. "Almost as impressive as the way you never deny anything directly, just deflect and redirect." He straightened up. "Mr. Blackwood would like to meet with you. Discuss a business proposition." "I'm afraid my schedule is quite full with the store," Elijah replied. "Perhaps another time." Luther shook his head slowly. "Wasn't a request, Morgan, or whatever your name really is." For the first time, something hardened in Elijah's expression. "I've made my position clear regarding Mr. Blackwood's previous offers." The younger man by the door chose this moment to interject. "You'd best reconsider, shopkeep. Mr. Blackwood don't like being refused." Luther shot the younger man a look of annoyed warning, but the damage was done. The delicate balance of the conversation had shifted. "I understand completely," Elijah said, his tone cooling several degrees. "Please convey my regrets to Mr. Blackwood. Now, unless you're interested in purchasing something, I have inventory to attend to." Luther studied Elijah for a long moment, then nodded almost imperceptibly. "We'll be seeing you again, Morgan. Count on it." He turned and headed for the door, gesturing for his companion to precede him. At the threshold, Luther paused. Without turning around, he said, "By the way, Marshal Everett had a distinctive scar on his left forearm, knife wound, shaped like a crescent moon. Quite memorable." Then he was gone, the door swinging shut behind him. Elijah remained motionless. For several minutes after their departure, his face unreadable. Finally, he moved to the window and watched the two men make their way back toward the copper nugget. Only when they were out of sight did he roll up his left sleeve, revealing a crescent-shaped scar exactly as Luther had described. That evening, as shadows lengthened across Copper Canyon, Elijah sat alone in his back room, the mysterious trunk open before him. He held the tarnished badge in one hand, turning it so it caught the lamplight. The words U.S. Marshal were still faintly visible. Despite years of deliberate neglect, a soft knock at the rear door interrupted his contemplation. Quickly returning the badge to the trunk and closing it, he crossed to the door, pistol in hand. "Who is it?" he called, positioning himself to the side of the doorframe. "Martha Winters," came the reply. "I'm alone." Elijah holstered his weapon and opened the door cautiously. Martha slipped inside, her expression grave. "Luther Cole was asking questions all over town after he left here," she reported without preamble. "About your background, your habits. He even asked Doc Miller if he'd ever treated you for an old wound on your arm." Elijah's mouth tightened. "I expected as much." "There's more," Martha continued. "Blackwood's called in reinforcements. 3. Riders came in an hour ago. Hard men, by the look of them. And there's talk of more on the way." Elijah nodded, absorbing this information. "He's preparing for a confrontation." Martha studied his face in the lamplight. "Elijah, Luther Cole called you Marshal at the general store today, loudly enough that Tilly Jenkins heard it from the dress shop next door." For a moment, Elijah closed his eyes, a fleeting expression of resignation crossing his features. "Tilly, Jenkins has sharp ears, and a sharper tongue," Martha added. "Half the town is wondering if we have a federal marshal in our midst." She paused, watching him intently. "Do we?" Elijah sighed deeply. "Not anymore. That life ended 7 years ago." "Because of your brother," Martha ventured gently. Surprise flickered across Elijah's face. "How did you—" "People talk. Luther mentioned a brother killed by a gang that left raven symbols." Martha's voice softened. "Was it Blackwood's gang?" Elijah moved to the small table where the photograph sat, picking it up with unusual tenderness. "No, not directly. Blackwood. It came later, adopted the symbol, built his own operation. But the original Raven gang—" His voice trailed off, memories clearly surfacing. "Your brother was a marshal too?" Martha asked, nodding toward the photograph. "Yes, Thomas was the better lawman, more measured, more patient." A sad smile touched Elijah's face. "I was always the hot-headed one, quicker to draw, slower to think." "What happened to him?" Elijah was silent for so long, Martha thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was different, harder, colder. "We were tracking the original Raven gang across 3 territories. They'd robbed 7 banks, killed 14 people that we knew of. We finally cornered them in a mining town called Bitter Creek." He set the photograph down carefully. "Thomas insisted on offering them surrender terms. Standard procedure, he said I wanted to go in shooting." His hands clenched involuntarily. "They shot him in the back while he was reading the warrant. I killed 3 of them before the rest escaped." "And you've been hunting them ever since?" Martha asked. Elijah shook his head. "I hunted them for 2 years. When I finally caught up with them, it didn't go as I'd planned. The violence solved. Nothing changed, nothing. Thomas was still gone." He gestured toward the photograph. After that, I turned in my badge, started moving from town to town, looking for somewhere quiet to exist. Until you found Copper Canyon, Martha observed. Yes, another town terrorized by men hiding behind raven symbols. A bitter laugh escaped him. The irony wasn't lost on me. So you came here to finish what you started? Martha's voice held no judgment, only curiosity. No, Elijah replied firmly. I came here to start over. Again, the store, the quiet life. That wasn't a lie. I meant it. He sighed heavily. But some patterns repeat themselves, whether we want them to or not. Martha considered this. Blackwood knows who you are. He suspects. Luther confirmed it today. What will you do now? Elijah turned to face her fully, his expression resolute. What needs doing? Blackwood won't stop. He can't afford to back down now, and neither can we. Martha nodded slowly. The others need to know the truth about who you are. Why? Elijah asked. What difference does it make? All the difference in the world, Martha replied firmly. They're ready to stand with you, Elijah. But they deserve to know what they're standing for, and who they're standing with. Before Elijah could respond, the distant sound of gunfire erupted from the direction of the Santiago farm. Both of them rushed to the window. Against the darkening sky, an ominous orange glow had appeared on the horizon. They're burning them out, Martha gasped. After everything last night. Elijah was already moving, retrieving his gun belt from the trunk and strapping it on with practiced efficiency. Get to the Coopers, keep them here. Warn anyone you can find. Blackwood's making his move earlier than I expected. You can't go alone, Martha protested. There must be a dozen of them out there. I won't be alone, Elijah replied grimly. Miguel has neighbors. They'll rally. He checked both revolvers with swift automatic movements. This is what Blackwood wants, to draw me out, separate me from the others. Then don't go, Martha urged. It's a trap. Of course it's a trap, Elijah agreed, shrugging into his coat. But the Santiagos are still in danger, real danger. He headed for the door, then paused. If I don't return, there's a letter in the trunk. It explains everything, who I was, what happened. Give it to the territorial authorities. Elijah, Martha began, but he cut her off with a raised hand. I made a mistake once, Martha. I walked away when I should have stood firm. I won't make that mistake again. His eyes met hers with fierce intensity. Now go, warn the others. If Blackwood's moving against the Santiago farm, he may strike in town as well. As Elijah slipped out into the gathering darkness, Martha stood in the doorway, watching his figure disappear down the alley. The gunfire had intensified, punctuated by distant shouts. The orange glow on the horizon had brightened, suggesting at least one structure was fully ablaze. With determined steps, Martha turned back into the store. Instead of heading immediately to warn the Coopers as Elijah had instructed, she moved to the trunk he had left open in his haste. Kneeling beside it, she rifled through the contents until she found what she sought. A small wooden box containing ammunition and a folded piece of paper. Unfolding the paper revealed a yellowed wanted poster. The illustration depicted a younger Silas Blackwood, listed under a different name. The charges included murder, robbery, and conspiracy. At the bottom, a note had been added in faded ink. Known associate of original Raven Gang, suspected in murder of Marshal Thomas Everett. Martha's breath caught. The connection was now clear. Blackwood wasn't just another tyrant terrorizing a helpless town. He was connected to the men who had killed Elijah's brother. Whether Elijah had known this before arriving in Copper Canyon remained unclear, but the revelation cast his presence in a new light. The sound of approaching horses interrupted her thoughts. Peering through the window, Martha saw several of Blackwood's men riding hard down the main street, heading for the mercantile. Among them was Luther Cole, his pale eyes fixed on the store with predatory focus. Martha tucked the wanted poster into her dress pocket and hurried toward the back room to warn the Coopers. The night was just beginning, and Copper Canyon stood on the precipice of a reckoning 7 years in the making. Whether Elijah, or any of them, would survive to see the dawn remained an open question. Outside town, Elijah rode toward the burning farm with grim purpose, the familiar weight of his revolvers at his sides. The years seemed to fall away with each hoofbeat, the careful facade of Elijah Morgan dissolving like morning mist. In his place rode the ghost of Marshal James Everett, resurrected by necessity and driven by a sense of justice long suppressed but never truly forgotten. The confrontation he had avoided for 7 years had found him nonetheless, drawn to him like iron to a lodestone. This time, however, he rode not for vengeance, but for something more profound, the chance to finally make things right. Flames illuminated the night sky above the Santiago farm, casting eerie, dancing shadows across the landscape. As Elijah crested the final ridge overlooking the property, the scene below unfolded with nightmarish clarity. The barn had already collapsed into a smoldering ruin, and fire licked hungrily at the corners of the main house. Blackwood's men, at least 8 that Elijah could immediately identify, had formed a loose perimeter around the burning structures. Miguel Santiago and his family huddled in the yard, held at gunpoint by Marcus Wade, whose gold tooth gleamed in the firelight as he laughed at their distress. Several of the Santiago children wept openly, clinging to their mother while their father stood rigid with suppressed fury. Most concerning was the figure seated atop a black stallion slightly removed from the others, Silas Blackwood himself, elegant even in villainy, observing the destruction with the detached interest of a man watching an insect struggle in a spider's web. Elijah dismounted, tethering his horse behind an outcropping of rock. He checked his revolvers one final time, the familiar weight of the weapons grounding him in the present moment. This wasn't Bitter Creek 7 years ago, yet the parallels were unmistakable. Another family terrorized, another showdown with men who hid behind raven symbols. Closing his eyes briefly, Elijah centered himself. Then, leaving his spectacles tucked in his breast pocket, no longer needed for the persona he'd abandoned, he began his approach, moving silently through the shadows with the practiced skill of a predator. He managed to get within 30 yards of the gathering before a sentry spotted him. The man opened his mouth to shout a warning, but Elijah's thrown rock caught him squarely in the temple, dropping him unconscious to the ground. The commotion, minimal though it was, drew the attention of Jeremiah Black, whose keen eyes scanned the darkness. "Someone's out there," he called, raising his rifle. Blackwood straightened in his saddle. "Marshal Everett," he announced, voice carrying easily across the yard. "I know you're watching. Why not join us? The Santiagos have been anticipating your arrival." Elijah hesitated only momentarily before stepping into the circle of firelight, hands deliberately away from his holsters. "Let them go, Blackwood. This is between you and me." A murmur rippled through Blackwood's men as they recognized the shopkeeper, now transformed by posture and demeanor into someone altogether more dangerous. Miguel Santiago's eyes widened in confusion at the name Blackwood had used. "Marshal Everett," Blackwood greeted him with mock cordiality. "Or do you prefer Morgan these days?" I must say the spectacles were a particularly effective touch. Almost had me fooled. He dismounted gracefully, adjusting his feathered hatband. "Almost. The family has nothing to do with this," Elijah stated flatly, ignoring the theatrical performance. "Let them go." Blackwood affected an expression of wounded surprise. "Nothing to do with it? On the contrary, they have everything to do with it. They're the bait that brought you here, after all." His smile chilled. "Just as your brother's sense of fair play brought him within range of my rifle at Bitter Creek." The admission hung in the air between them, confirmation of what Elijah had long suspected but never confirmed. Blackwood had been there, not just connected to the original Raven gang, but personally present when Thomas died. You remember that day, don't you, Marshal? Blackwood continued, circling slowly. Your brother with his warrant papers, so proper, so righteous, standing in the open like he expected hardened killers to surrender peacefully. He laughed softly. I always wondered if you realized it was my bullet that took him. I was positioned in the church bell tower, perfect vantage point. Elijah's expression remained impassive, but something dangerous flickered in his eyes. I know exactly who you are, Blackwood. I've known since before I arrived in Copper Canyon. This revelation clearly surprised Blackwood, who paused momentarily before recovering. Yet you didn't come guns blazing. Interesting. The James Everett I remember would have shot first and asked questions of the corpse. That man died with his brother, Elijah replied evenly. I came here to start over. But you chose my town, Blackwood observed, hardly coincidental. I followed the pattern, Elijah acknowledged. Terrorized settlements, mysterious property transfers, Raven symbols. Your particular signature hasn't changed. Why the restraint then? Blackwood demanded, genuinely curious. You had 7 years to hunt me down. Why play shopkeeper in my town instead of putting a bullet in my head the moment you arrived? Elijah's gaze flicked briefly to the Santiago family, then back to Blackwood. Because I learned the hard way that vengeance solves nothing. It doesn't bring back the dead. It doesn't heal what's broken. He gestured toward the burning barn. But justice might. Real justice, not just more bloodshed. Blackwood's face hardened. Noble sentiments from a man surrounded by guns. Tell me, Marshal, how do you envision justice being served tonight? Before Elijah could respond, the clatter of approaching horses drew everyone's attention. From the darkness emerged a group of riders, Martha Winters at the lead, followed by Old Jenkins, the Wilkinsons, and at least a dozen other townspeople and farmers, all armed and resolute. Reinforcements, Martha called out as they reined in, at the edge of the firelight. Sorry we're late, Marshal. Blackwood's men shifted uneasily, recalculating odds that had suddenly tilted against them. Luther Cole, positioned off to the side, remained impassive, his hand hovering near his weapon, but making no move to draw. What is this? Blackwood demanded, his composure slipping. You really think this rabble can stand against professional gunmen? They already have, Elijah replied, at this very farm just last night. He turned slightly to address the newcomers without fully taking his eyes off Blackwood. Martha, get the Santiagos. Wade tightened his grip on Miguel Santiago's arm. They ain't going nowhere. Marcus, Luther Cole spoke for the first time, his raspy voice cutting through the tension. Let them go. Wade's head snapped toward Luther in disbelief. The hell you saying, Cole? Count the guns, Luther advised calmly. Look at the faces. These people are done being afraid. Push them now, blood flows. Lot of blood. A tense silence followed as Wade struggled between obedience to Blackwood and the veteran gunman's assessment. Finally, with a curse, he released Miguel's arm and stepped back. Martha and 2 others quickly moved forward, ushering the Santiago family towards safety behind the line of townspeople. Elena Santiago clutched her youngest child to her chest, tears of relief streaming down her face. This doesn't change anything, Blackwood declared, though his tone lacked conviction. These people have nowhere to go. This is my town, my territory. Not anymore, came a new voice from the darkness. Sheriff Coleman emerged into the firelight, badge gleaming on his chest, accompanied by 3 deputies from the neighboring county. His usual slumped posture was gone, replaced by a rigid determination. Silas. Blackwood, Coleman announced formally, you're under arrest for arson, extortion, assault, and the murder of Thomas Everett, United States Marshal. Blackwood's face contorted with rage and disbelief. You? He snarled at Coleman. You've been in my pocket for years. You're as guilty as I am. Maybe so, Coleman acknowledged, something like shame crossing his weathered features. And I'll answer for that. But not tonight. Tonight I'm just doing the job I swore to do. Elijah studied Coleman with newfound respect. What changed your mind, Sheriff? Coleman's gaze dropped momentarily. Martha showed me the wanted poster, made me realize how far I'd fallen. He straightened, meeting Elijah's eyes. Some of us take longer to find our courage, Marshal, but better late than never. Blackwood, seeing his position deteriorating rapidly, made a desperate play. Luther, he called sharply, take care of this problem. Now. All eyes turned to Luther Cole, the most feared gunman in Blackwood's employ. For a long, breathless moment, he stood motionless, pale eyes moving from Blackwood to Elijah to the assembled townsfolk. Then, with deliberate slowness, he unbuckled his gun belt and let it drop to the ground. No more, he said simply. I've buried enough men. Coward! Blackwood spat, his refined veneer cracking completely. Traitor! After everything I've paid you! Luther shrugged, unmoved by the accusation. Some things aren't worth any price. Figure I realized that before you did. With his most formidable enforcer standing down, the fight visibly drained from Blackwood's remaining men. One by one, they lowered their weapons, unwilling to die for a losing cause. All except Marcus Wade. To hell with all of you, he snarled, drawing his pistol with vicious intent. I ain't surrendering to no farmers and has-been lawmen. His gun cleared leather, swinging toward Coleman, the closest and most despised target. Time seemed to compress as multiple people shouted warnings. Coleman fumbled for his own weapon, too slow by half. Elijah moved. The draw that had once made James Everett legendary throughout the territories happened almost too fast to follow. Both Remingtons appeared in his hands as if conjured there, and a single shot rang out with decisive finality. Wade staggered backward, his unfired pistol tumbling from nerveless fingers. He looked down in bewilderment at the spreading red stain just below his collarbone, then back up at Elijah with confused indignation before collapsing to his knees. You didn't kill me, he gasped, pressing a hand to the wound. No, Elijah agreed, holstering one revolver while keeping the other trained on Blackwood. But I could have. Remember that when you're standing trial alongside your employer. Blackwood, seeing his last desperate gambit fail, suddenly lunged toward his horse where a rifle waited in its scabbard. He managed 2 steps before Elijah's. Warning shot kicked up dirt at his feet. Don't, Elijah advised quietly. You won't make it. For a moment, madness gleamed in Blackwood's eyes, the cornered predator considering one final suicidal attack. Then, like a puppet with cut strings, he sagged in defeat. You've ruined everything, he said bitterly, as Coleman approached with manacles. No, Elijah corrected him. You did that yourself, a long time ago at Bitter Creek. As Coleman secured Blackwood and his deputies began processing the other captured men, Martha approached Elijah, who stood slightly apart, watching the proceedings with an unreadable expression. So, she said softly, Marshal James Everett, the legendary ghost of the territories. That's who's been selling me calico and coffee these past months. Elijah, or James, offered a small, tired smile. Elijah Morgan isn't entirely fiction. He's the man I've been trying to become. Martha studied him thoughtfully. And now, will Elijah Morgan stay in Copper Canyon, or will Marshal Everett ride on once this is finished? Before he could answer, Daniel Cooper approached, his young face alight with excitement and relief. Mr. Morgan, you were amazing. The way you drew on Wade, I've never seen anything like it. James glanced at Martha, then back to Daniel. Thank you, but remember what we discussed in our lessons. Speed means nothing without judgment. Daniel nodded earnestly. Yes, sir, I remember. Over the next hours, order gradually emerged from chaos. The townspeople formed a bucket brigade to save what remained of the Santiago house. The county deputies secured Blackwood and his captured men for transport to the territorial jail. Sheriff Coleman, looking both exhausted and somehow unburdened, coordinated efforts to document statements from witnesses. By dawn, Blackwood sat, securely bound in a wagon with his surviving men, surrounded by armed deputies. His once immaculate clothing was soiled with soot and dirt, his aristocratic features haggard with the knowledge of his impending fate. "It won't stick, you know," he called to James as the wagons prepared to depart. "Men like me have friends. In territorial offices, judges who can be persuaded." James approached the wagon, standing just beyond Blackwood's reach. For a moment, he studied the man who had haunted his existence for 7 years, first as a faceless enemy, then as an obsession, and finally as the architect of his brother's death. "It might not," James acknowledged. "Justice is imperfect, but Copper Canyon is free of you, and that's enough for now." Blackwood's lips curled in a sneer. "And if I return, what then, Marshal?" James held his gaze steadily. "I'll be waiting." Something in his tone, not a threat, but a simple statement of fact, finally penetrated Blackwood's bravado. For the first time, genuine fear flickered across his features before he looked away. As the wagons rolled out carrying Blackwood and his men toward whatever justice awaited them, the people of Copper Canyon gathered in the early morning light. The Santiago house, though damaged, still stood, a testament to collective effort and shared purpose. Miguel Santiago approached James, extending his hand. "Marshal Everett," he said formally, "my family owes you everything." James took the offered, "And you owe me nothing, and it's Morgan, Elijah Morgan." Miguel's eyebrows rose slightly, but he nodded in understanding. "Elijah Morgan, then. Will you stay in Copper Canyon? The Mercantile provides a valuable service." James began, but was interrupted by Martha. "Of course he's staying," she declared confidently. "We still have a town to rebuild, and I'm not about to start ordering supplies from some stranger." A ripple of laughter spread through the gathered townspeople, tension releasing after the long night. James looked around at their faces. Tired, but triumphant, marked by a new sense of community forged in adversity. "I suppose the store does need tending," he admitted, a genuine smile softening his features. Later, as people dispersed to their homes and farms, James stood alone at the edge of the Santiago property, watching the sun rise fully over the hills. The broken pocket watch, his brother's, weighed in his vest pocket, a tangible reminder of all that had led him to this moment. Sheriff Coleman approached, his footsteps deliberately heavy to announce his presence. "Territorial authorities will want a statement," he said, "about who you are. Your history with Blackwood." James nodded. "I'll provide what's needed." Coleman shifted uncomfortably. "For what it's worth, I'm sorry. About everything. The blind eye. The complicity." He gestured vaguely toward the departing wagons. "All of it." "You made your choices," James replied, not unkindly. "Then you made a different one when it mattered most. That counts for something." "Will you take the badge again?" Coleman asked. "The territory could use a man like you officially, not just hiding behind a shopkeeper's counter." James considered the question, watching as Martha organized the remaining townspeople into teams to help the Santiagos salvage what they could. Daniel Cooper worked alongside his mother, their movements purposeful, their faces bearing the marks of people who had endured hardship but refused to be defined by it. "No," he said finally. "I think Elijah Morgan has work to do here. Important work." Coleman seemed to understand. With a respectful nod, he left James to his thoughts. Alone again, James removed the pocket watch from his vest. The cracked face had stopped at the exact moment Thomas fell at Bitter Creek. For 7 years, he had carried it as a reminder of failure and loss, a wound deliberately kept open. Now, for the first time, he wound it carefully. The mechanism resisted, briefly, then yielded with a soft clicking sound. He adjusted the hands to the correct time, listening to the steady tick-tick-tick as the second hand resumed its journey. "Rest easy, Thomas," he whispered, returning the watch to his pocket. "It's done." In the distance, Daniel waved, calling him to join the rebuilding efforts. James, or Elijah, as he would now fully become, nodded and started toward them, each step carrying him further from the past and into a future he had never expected, but now embraced. The town of Copper Canyon had found its guardian, not in the legendary marshal he once was, but in the shopkeeper he had chosen to become. Summer faded into autumn, bringing cooler breezes and golden hues to the landscape surrounding Copper Canyon. 3 months had passed since Silas Blackwood's arrest, months filled with rebuilding, renewal, and unexpected transformations throughout the once oppressed community. The territorial court had convened in Santa Fe to hear the case against Blackwood and his associates. The proceedings stretched over 2 grueling weeks, during which Elijah Morgan, now publicly acknowledged as former Marshal James Everett, provided testimony alongside Sheriff Coleman, Martha Winters, and numerous other residents of Copper Canyon. Evidence proved overwhelming. Blackwood was sentenced to 20 years in the territorial prison, effectively ending his reign of terror. Most of his men received lesser sentences, except Marcus Wade, whose previous crimes, combined with attempted murder at the Santiago farm, earned him a place alongside his employer in the maximum security wing. Upon returning to Copper Canyon after the trial, Elijah found the mercantile not only intact, but thriving under Martha's temporary management. She had expanded inventory, negotiated better supply arrangements with traveling merchants, and even added a small reading section with newspapers and books, a luxury the town hadn't previously enjoyed. "Hope you don't mind the changes," she said when he walked through the door, the small bell jingling a welcome. "Figured a man of your background might appreciate having the latest news available." Elijah surveyed the modifications with quiet approval. "You've done more with it in 3 weeks than I managed in 3 months. Martha's raised eyebrow communicated volumes. "That's because you were busy planning how to take down Blackwood, whether you admitted it to yourself or not." She handed him a ledger. "Besides, I had help. Daniel has quite a head for business when he applies himself." The mention of Daniel Cooper brought a smile to Elijah's face. The boy had blossomed in recent months, channeling his anger over his father's disappearance into productive directions. Under Elijah's guidance, he continued his morning exercises. No longer focused on fighting, but on discipline, awareness, and the measured application of strength. "How is he?" Elijah asked, hanging his coat on the familiar peg behind the counter. "Growing an inch a week, seems like," Martha replied, "and asking when you'd return almost hourly. Sarah says he's been practicing his ledger work religiously, determined to impress you." As if summoned by the conversation, the mercantile door swung open, and Daniel burst in, face alight with excitement. "Mr. Morgan, you're back!" He caught himself remembering the recent revelations. "Or should I call you Marshal Everett now?" "Morgan will do just fine," Elijah assured him, extending his hand. The boy shook it with newfound confidence. "I hear you've been keeping the store running smoothly." Daniel straightened proudly. "Yes, sir. Mrs. Winters taught me about ordering and inventory, and the reading corner was my idea." "A fine one," Elijah acknowledged. "Knowledge is as important as any supply we could stock." Later that afternoon, after catching up on town developments, Elijah walked the main street of Copper Canyon, noting changes both subtle and profound. The abandoned sheriff's office had been repainted and properly staffed. Coleman had resigned after the trial, recognizing that his complicity with Blackwood had compromised his authority beyond repair. In his place, the county had appointed Samuel Turner, a no-nonsense lawman with an unbending ethical code. The Copper Nugget Saloon had changed ownership, purchased by a consortium of local business people who transformed it from a den of iniquity into a respectable establishment where families could gather. Its new name, the Miner's Rest, symbolized the community's determination to reclaim its heritage from Blackwood's corruption. Most striking were the faces Elijah encountered, townsfolk who now met his eyes directly, nodding in greeting without the furtive, haunted expressions that had characterized Copper Canyon under Blackwood's shadow. Children played openly in the street rather than being hurried indoors at the first sound of approaching horses. At the edge of town, construction had begun on a modest schoolhouse, funded by donations from revitalized businesses and farms. Sarah Cooper had volunteered to teach, drawing on education she'd received back east before marrying and moving west. As sunset approached, Elijah made his way to the small cemetery on the hill overlooking Copper Canyon. There, a freshly carved headstone marked a symbolic grave for Daniel's father and others who had disappeared during Blackwood's reign. Blackwood had refused to reveal the locations of his victims' remains, denying families even the closure of proper burial. Elijah stood before the memorial stone, hat in hand, when he sensed, rather than heard, someone approach. "Thought I might find you here," said Luther Cole, his lean figure silhouetted against the setting sun. Elijah tensed momentarily, old habits dying hard before relaxing. After testifying against Blackwood, Luther had been granted immunity for his lesser crimes. A controversial decision, but one Elijah had supported. The veteran gunman had proven crucial to securing Blackwood's conviction. "Paying respects," Elijah explained simply. Luther nodded, understanding without need for elaboration. "Heading out tomorrow," he said after a moment of respectful silence. "Figured I should say goodbye." "Where will you go?" Elijah asked, genuinely curious about what path a man like Luther might choose after decades of violence. "North, maybe. Montana territory. Someplace where nobody's heard of Luther Cole." He gazed across the landscape, eyes reflecting the twilight. "Might try ranching. Always had a way with horses." "It's never too late to start over," Elijah observed, the words carrying personal resonance. Luther's weathered face creased in what might have been a smile. "That what you're doing, Marshal? Starting over?" "Been trying to for 7 years," Elijah admitted. "Maybe this time it'll take." Luther considered this. "Difference is, you've got something worth staying for now." He gestured toward the town. Below, where lamps were being lit in windows, casting warm rectangles of light into the gathering dusk. "They look at you different than they look at me. Should take advantage of that while it lasts." Before Elijah could respond, Luther extended his hand, a gesture so uncharacteristic it momentarily surprised both men. They shook briefly, the handshake an acknowledgement between two men who had walked similar dark paths, but now sought different destinations. "One thing I never asked," Luther said as he turned to leave. "That day at Bitter Creek, when your brother fell, you tracked down the original Raven Gang afterward. Didn't you?" Elijah's expression remained carefully neutral. "I did." "And?" Luther pressed. "Justice was served," Elijah replied simply, offering nothing more. Luther studied him with new respect. "Some secrets are worth keeping, I suppose." With a final nod, he walked away, disappearing into the shadows between cemetery and town. The following day brought the community gathering Martha had organized to officially welcome back Elijah from the trial. Despite his protestations that such celebration was unnecessary, the mercantile filled with townspeople bearing dishes of food, bottles of drink, and unmistakable goodwill. Miguel Santiago and his family arrived with fresh cheese and bread. Old Jenkins brought his fiddle. The Wilkinsons contributed a barrel of apple cider from their recovering orchard. Even Sheriff Turner made an appearance, awkwardly presenting Elijah with a small carved wooden box containing a symbolic key to the town. As the celebration unfolded around him, Elijah found himself uncharacteristically emotional. For years he had drifted from place to place, never allowing himself to form attachments, always carrying his brother's death like a stone in his chest. Now, surrounded by people who knew his true identity, yet accepted him regardless, he felt that burden lightening incrementally. Martha Winters appeared at his side, offering a cup of cider. "You look positively uncomfortable with all this attention," she observed with characteristic directness. "Not used to it," he admitted, accepting the drink gratefully. "Better get used to it," she advised. "You're stuck with us now, Elijah Morgan." The use of his chosen name rather than his birth name did not escape his notice. "That obvious, is it? To me, at least." Martha's gaze softened slightly. "The way you look at this town now, like a man who's finally found home after years of wandering, I recognize it because I had that same look when I first came to Copper Canyon, before Blackwood." Elijah considered her words, finding truth in them. "I never planned to stay," he confessed. "Even after identifying Blackwood, I thought I'd move on once he was dealt with, continue drifting. And now..." He looked around the crowded store, at Daniel helping younger children reach the cookie plate, at Sarah Cooper laughing with Elena Santiago, at the mingled faces of farmers and townsfolk united by shared experience rather than divided by fear. "Now, I think Elijah Morgan might have more living to do," he said finally, "right here." As twilight deepened into evening, the gathering moved outdoors, where makeshift tables had been arranged in the street. Lanterns hung from awnings, casting golden pools of light across faces animated by conversation and laughter. Old Jenkins' fiddle sang joyously, joined by a younger man's harmonica and impromptu percussion on washboards and pots. Daniel Cooper approached Elijah, who had stepped back to observe the festivities from a slight distance. "Mr. Morgan," he began with uncharacteristic hesitation, "my mother and I have been talking about my father." Elijah gave the boy his full attention. "Go on. She says she's ready to accept that he's not coming back, that we need to move forward." Daniel swallowed hard. "But I wanted to ask, with your experience tracking people, do you think there's any chance he might still be alive somewhere? That Blackwood might have sold him to a mining camp or something instead of..." The unfinished question hung in the air between them. Elijah considered his response carefully, knowing the weight his words would carry. "Daniel, in my experience, hope is never wasted," he said finally, "but it needs to be balanced with truth. Your father stood against Blackwood when few others dared. That took exceptional courage. Whatever happened afterward doesn't diminish that courage." Daniel nodded slowly, processing this. "I want to be like him. And like you, too. Someone who stands up when it matters." Elijah rested a hand on the boy's shoulder. "You already are. Every time you help your mother, every time you work toward rebuilding this town, you honor his memory. That's how we truly keep people alive after they're gone." As Daniel rejoined the celebration, Martha approached again, this time with a small package wrapped in brown paper. "Found this while organizing your storeroom," she explained, handing it to him. "Thought tonight might be the right time to return." Elijah unwrapped the package to find the tarnished U.S. Marshal badge he had kept hidden in his trunk for 7 years. He ran his thumb across the 5-pointed star, feeling its familiar contours. "I didn't take this," he said, looking at Martha questioningly. "No, but I did," she admitted, without a trace of remorse. "The night of the Santiago farm confrontation. I was worried you might not come back, that we'd need something to prove who you were to the authorities." Instead of the irritation Martha might have expected, Elijah smiled, a genuine, unguarded expression rarely seen on his usually reserved features. "Thank you," he said, carefully rewrapping the badge. not for preserving evidence, but for caring what happened to me." Martha's reply was interrupted by Sheriff Turner calling for attention. The music quieted, and the gathered townspeople turned expectantly toward the new lawman. "Folks, I've been in Copper Canyon just 3 months now," Turner began, his voice carrying clearly in the evening air. "In that time, I've seen a community rising from intimidation and fear to become something remarkable. That transformation didn't happen by accident. It happened because one man refused to look away from injustice, even when disguised as a humble shopkeeper." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Turner raised his glass. "To Elijah Morgan, or James Everett if you prefer, a man who taught us that courage isn't about wearing a badge, but about standing firm when standing's hardest. To Elijah." The crowd echoed, glasses raised in unified tribute. As the celebration continued around him, Elijah felt the weight of the wrapped badge in his pocket. James Everett had come to Copper Canyon seeking closure, perhaps even vengeance, for a brother lost to violence. Instead, he had found something entirely unexpected. A community worth serving not with a gun, but with the steady presence of Elijah Morgan, shopkeeper and citizen. The broken pocket watch ticked steadily in his vest, keeping proper time for the first time in 7 years. Life, like the watch, had resumed its forward motion. The past would always remain part of him, but it no longer defined his future. In the end, Elijah's greatest achievement wasn't capturing Blackwood or avenging his brother. It was helping ordinary people rediscover their collective strength, reminding them that even in the darkest times, courage is contagious, hope is resilient, and one person standing firm can inspire others to rise. Copper Canyon would tell his story for generations to come. How a quiet shopkeeper with scarred hands and haunted eyes became the unlikely guardian of a town's rebirth. But the truest measure of his legacy wasn't found in legends or tales told around campfires. It lived in the straightened shoulders of those who once cowered. It flourished in the laughter of children who played without fear. It endured in the determined spirits of ordinary people who had learned, finally, that they were never as powerless as they believed. That knowledge, that awakening, would outlast any single hero, no matter how fast his draw or how noble his sacrifice. And for Elijah Morgan, formerly Marshal James Everett, that knowledge was enough. More than enough. It was everything. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.